Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. I know you love those deep dives into the big questions, but, sometimes it's easy to get lost in the weeds, and that's where we come in.
Exactly. We're here to cut through the jargon, the complexity, and get straight to the heart of these fascinating ideas.
Right. So today we're tackling someone whose thought is, well, massively influential, particularly for those of us with a philosophical bent.
We are. Wilhelm von Humboldt, a 19th century thinker, and his work is enjoying a resurgence of interest, particularly in, well, you guessed it, linguistics and philosophy of language.
And we all know those are pretty vital for any philosopher, right?
Absolutely. In fact, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a pretty comprehensive entry on him, and that's going to be our guide for this deep dive.
Excellent. Now, this guy, he wasn't just a one-trick pony. He had his fingers in so many pies. Philosophy, obviously, literature, linguistics, anthropology, even education, and political thought. I mean, the breadth of his interests is really impressive.
It is, and that makes him all the more intriguing for us, right?
Right, absolutely. But for this deep dive, we're going to try and extract those real philosophical gems, those aha moments that make you see things in a new light.
Exactly. The goal is to understand, as quickly and thoroughly as possible, how his insights can inform our own philosophical journeys.
Right. So we're not going to get bogged down in every detail. Our focus is going to be on, well, some of his most important contributions.
His views on language, how it interacts with thought, shapes our understanding of the world, and his really unique approach to comparing different languages.
So where do we even begin with someone like Humboldt? I mean, the guy was a walking encyclopedia. His intellectual development must have been, well, something else.
It really was. I mean, think about this. His early education was through private tutors. But these weren't just your average tutors. These guys were connected to the Berlin Enlightenment, this hotbed of new ideas about law, governance, and they exposed him to some heavy hitters in philosophy. Leibniz, Hume, Locke, the classic. And then you throw in his deep dive into ancient Greek thought.
So like a real mix of Enlightenment rationalism and classical wisdom, all in one package.
Yeah, pretty much. And it shows. I mean, at 19, he's already grappling with Socrates and Plato's concept of divinity, writing a defense of natural religion, a very Enlightenment thing to do.
Right. So these influences are shaping his thinking from a very early age.
Oh, absolutely. And then, he's hanging out in the salon of Marcus and Henriette Hearst, right in the thick of Berlin's intellectual scene.
So he's surrounded by stimulating conversation and debate, a perfect environment for a budding philosopher.
Was. And then he goes off to Göttingen University. He's studying with Heym, the classical philologist Lichtenberg, this brilliant natural scientist. But here's the kicker he's also deep diving into, Kant.
Kant. Okay, now things are getting serious. For philosophers, that's like, well, the mother lode.
It is. It shows he's engaging with questions about the structure of human understanding, the limits of reason that's core philosophical territory.
Absolutely. But he wasn't just an armchair philosopher, right? He was tackling real-world issues, too.
Yeah, he was involved in the religious debates of his time, his work on religion, that kind of thing. And he wrote, get this, The Spheres and Duties of Government.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, he was arguing for limited government and individual freedom. Ideas that, had more traction initially in England with guys like John Stuart Mill than in Germany.
So already we see this kind of forward-thinking liberal streak in his political philosophy, ideas that resonate with later philosophical debates about liberty and individual rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he makes this move to Jena, which was like the epicenter of German idealism and romanticism. Think Fichte, the Schlegel brothers. It was a pretty exciting time to be there.
Oh, I can imagine. And it's there he meets Goethe and Schiller. Not bad company to keep.
Not bad at all. He becomes their philosophical confidant, a collaborator. In fact, his insights actually helped shape some of their major works, like Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, those philosophical poems, and Goethe's Hermann and Dorothea, Wilhelm Meister. I mean, talk about influence.
That's pretty incredible. He wasn't just studying philosophy, he was actively participating in its evolution.
He was. And then he's writing for Schiller's journal, Die Horen, contributing these essays on sexual difference, on the male and female form. He's starting to explore, anthropological and aesthetic ideas, areas with huge philosophical implications.
Definitely. And we start to see this comparative method emerging, right? He's comparing different forms, different ideas, which I'm guessing is going to play a major role in his linguistic work.
It will. He even collaborates with his brother, Alexander and Goethe, of all people, on comparative anatomy.
Okay.
So he's laying the groundwork for what will become comparative anthropology, a field with, huge philosophical significance.
Fascinating. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry talks about this so-called linguistic turn that happens when Humboldt is in Paris. What prompted this shift in his focus? What philosophical changes were taking place?
Well, Paris was a hub of intellectual activity, right? He's rubbing shoulders with Sieyès, Tracy, Constant, Madame de Staël, all these major figures, and he's diving deep into French literature philosophy. He even critiques Condillac, the guy who emphasized sensation as the sole source of knowledge. Humboldt found that too limiting.
So he's engaging critically with these key thinkers, refining his own philosophical stance.
Exactly. And he's still writing about aesthetics, completes his Essays in Aesthetics the first on Gyrus Hermann and Dorothea, which is all about the creative imagination.
So that theme of creativity, which is so central to philosophy of art, is still very much on his mind.
It is. But then something happens. He stumbles upon, well, not stumbles upon, he kind of intentionally seeks out this entirely different linguistic system, the Basque language.
Ah, Basque, the linguistic outlier, famously unrelated to its Indo-European neighbors. So, what was it about Basque that was so transformative for his philosophical thinking about language?
Its very uniqueness. I mean, it challenged the dominant linguistic theories of the time, which were very much focused on Indo-European languages. Yes.
So, it forced him to broaden his perspective, to consider alternative ways of structuring language, alternative ways of thinking.
Exactly. But it's not just that. He adopts this really innovative approach to studying it. Instead of just relying on existing theories, he's going out and doing what we'd call field work. He's studying original Basque texts, talking to native speakers, immersing himself in the language and its culture. And this leads him to start questioning that dominant view of language as just a tool for representing pre-existing thoughts.
So, the idea that language just mirrors reality, that there's this one-to-one correspondence between words and things.
Yeah, that idea. He begins to see language as something more active, something that might actually shape how we understand the world. And that, for a philosopher, is a pretty big deal.
Huge. It raises all sorts of questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality itself. Linguistic relativity and all that.
Exactly. And this is a theme that's going to run through all of his later work.
Okay, so Basque really shakes things up for him. And then he ends up in Rome.
Right, as the Prussian envoy to the Vatican, no less. Now, while he's busy with diplomatic duties, he doesn't stop his intellectual work. He's still digging into Basque. Yeah. But he also goes back to ancient Greek, deepens his understanding, even develops his own theory of translation, which, by the way, is a whole other rabbit hole we could go down.
Oh yeah, translation, a philosopher's nightmare. Always grappling with those slippery issues of meaning and interpretation.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Something happens in Rome that's going to be even more crucial for his development as a linguist. He meets this guy, Lorenzo Hervas.
And who was he?
Hervas was a Spanish Jesuit priest who had this massive collection of materials on Native American languages. I mean, we're talking a treasure trove of linguistic data.
Wow. So Humboldt now has access to not just one, but two entirely different linguistic families, Basque and Native American languages.
Yeah. And this exposure to this incredible diversity of linguistic structures is going to be key in shaping his comparative approach and his broader philosophical views on language.
So those seeds planted by his early work comparing anatomy and aesthetic forms are now starting to sprout.
They are. And then he returns to Germany and jumps right into public service. I mean, he's reforming the Prussian education system, advocating for principles that, are still debated today. Think research and teaching, how those two should interact. He's also instrumental in establishing the University of Berlin, which was founded on this idea of fostering intellectual inquiry and scholarship.
So not a bad track record for a philosopher-turned-educator.
Not bad at all. And then, in 1820, he drops this bombshell, his vision for a new field, comparative linguistics.
Okay, so this is where his philosophical ideas and his empirical research really come together.
They do. He argues famously that language is not just a tool for representing thought, it's a formative organ of thought. For philosophers, that's, well, mind-blowing.
It is. It's saying that language doesn't just passively reflect our thoughts. It actively shapes how we think, how we perceive the world.
Exactly. He believed that those differences between languages, they're not just superficial, different sounds and symbols. They reflect, get this, differences of representing the world, different Weltansicht, worldviews. He's saying that each language has a unique way of carving up reality, a unique way of seeing things. And this is why, he argues, you can't separate philosophy of language from the empirical study of languages. They need each other.
Right, so you can't just sit in your armchair and theorize about language without getting your hands dirty, studying actual languages, their structures, their nuances.
Exactly. And you can't just analyze languages without a solid philosophical framework, without thinking about the big questions, what is language, what is thought, how do they relate to reality?
It's that interplay between theory and observation that's so crucial in philosophy. And he put his money where his mouth was, right? He didn't just theorize, he went out and studied languages from all over the world.
He did. And we're not talking just a few languages. He's looking at a massive range of a vast array. His brother Alexander, who was, no slouch himself, a renowned scientist, he was amazed by the depth of Wilhelm's linguistic insights. And he wasn't working in isolation. He was corresponding with all these scholars in Europe, the Americas, sharing data, debating ideas. He even amassed this huge collection of linguistic materials, probably the largest in Europe at the time.
That's some serious dedication.
It was, and his contributions were significant. I mean, he definitively established the existence of the Austronesian language family. He gave these addresses to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, tackling everything from the methodology of history, what we now call hermeneutics, to the grammatical structures of Chinese, the languages of the South Sea Islands. I mean, the guy was a linguistic powerhouse.
It's like he was trying to map the entire landscape of human thought by studying its diverse linguistic expressions. Okay, so let's dig into some of his core philosophical concepts about language. How did he challenge the traditional understanding of the linguistic sign?
Well, the traditional view, especially in philosophy, was that signs were basically just arbitrary labels. You slap a word onto a thing and that's it.
So like a word is just a name tag, a sticker you put on an object.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
But Humboldt, he saw things differently. He argued that thinking itself is this process of differentiation, of segmentation. Our experience of the world is this constant flow, and in order to think about it, we need to create units to distinguish subject from object, that kind of thing. And he argued that this process of segmentation is guided by these general forms of our sensibility.
Okay, so he's drawing on Kant here, the idea that our minds have these innate structures, categories of understanding that shape how we perceive and organize the world.
Exactly. And language, for Humboldt, it's like the sensory designation of these mentally segmented units. It's how we give external form to our internal distinctions.
So it's not just about naming pre-existing things, it's about actively creating those distinctions in the first place.
Exactly. And here he's kind of anticipating this linguistic idea of the principle of double articulation, which says that language works on these two levels. You've got meaningless sounds, phonemes, that combine to create meaningful units, morphemes, and words.
So it's not just a random collection of sounds. There's a system, a structure that allows us to build meaning.
Right. And he saw the linguistic sign not as just a two-part thing, signifier and signified, but as a three-part thing. You have the sound, the ton, the mental representation, the Vorstellung, and then the synthesis of the two.
So it's not just a word attached to a thing. There's this active mental process involved in creating meaning.
Absolutely. And then he had this fascinating anthropological perspective on the origins of language. He argued that language emerges at the same time as the first act of reflection. Humanity wakes up from what he called the stupor of desire and becomes self-conscious. And the word, the spoken word, is like that initial intellectual spark that allows us to pause, to reflect on our experience.
So it's not just about communication, it's about the emergence of self-awareness itself.
Right. And this contrasts with those philosophical accounts like Hobbes and Hegel that emphasize conflict or social interaction as the primary drivers of self-awareness. For Humboldt, language is this civilizing force. It enables us to understand ourselves and connect with others.
So language is the foundation of both individual and social existence. What about the concept of a philosophical grammar? That was a big deal in his time, right? How did he view that idea?
He wasn't a fan. These philosophical grammars, they basically took the grammatical structures of Latin or French, these dominant languages, and tried to impart them on every other language.
So a kind of linguistic imperialism, forcing everything into a single mold.
Yeah, pretty much. And Humboldt, he saw this as distorting those unique characteristics, ignoring the internal logic of each language.
But he did believe in linguistic universals, right?
He did. But he argued that these universals didn't manifest as this single universal grammar. They were rooted in, you guessed it, universal mental structures, those Kantian categories.
So there's this common ground, a shared human capacity for language, but it expresses itself in all these diverse and unique ways.
Exactly. And to compare languages meaningfully. Without imposing this Eurocentric framework, he introduced the concept of type.
Type.
Yeah, he borrowed it from Goethe, who had this idea of the Erbpflanz, the archetypal plant. It's not a real existing plant, but it embodies those fundamental principles of plant organization.
So it's like a blueprint, a template, but an abstract one, not tied to any specific species.
Exactly. And Humboldt's type is like that, but for language.
Yeah.
It represents those essential elements, the underlying rule systems of speech production.
So it's a way of comparing different languages without forcing them into a single predetermined mold. And this leads to his famous distinction between language as product and language as activity.
It does. He talked about work, products or ergon, and Tätigkeit, activity or energia. And this isn't the same as Saussure's Lang and Parole. It's a bit different. Well, Humboldt's point is that language is fundamentally dynamic. It really comes alive in the moment of speaking. He said its true definition can only be a genetic one. He's emphasizing that ongoing creative process.
So it's not just a static system of rules, it's a living, evolving thing. That's a pretty radical idea, even today.
It is. And he distinguishes between Sprach, the underlying capacity, and Read, the actual speech act.
So there's the potential, the possibility of language, and then there's its realization in the actual spoken word.
Exactly. Now, given how groundbreaking his work was, how did people react? What was his legacy?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. A thinker this innovative, I imagine he faced some resistance.
He did. Initially, a lot of mainstream linguists in Germany, they kind of ignored him. They were
Well,
all about Indo-European languages and historical reconstruction.
so they weren't ready for his more holistic, comparative approach.
Not really. Even Franz Bopp, this big name in Indo-European studies, he dismissed those South Pacific languages as like degenerate forms of Sanskrit, even though Humboldt had shown that they weren't. And when his philosophical works were published after his death, the editor, he was critical, didn't fully grasp the depth of his arguments.
So he was ahead of his time in many ways.
He was. There was some interest in France, especially in his work on Asian languages and Basque. But even there, they didn't always get the philosophical significance. It's only really in the late 20th century that he's been rediscovered, his ideas fully appreciated. And there's this ongoing critical edition of his works that's giving us an even deeper understanding of his contributions.
It's amazing how often the true innovators are initially misunderstood or dismissed. But it's great that he's finally getting the recognition he deserves. So for our listeners out there, those philosophy lovers, what are the key takeaways from Humboldt's work? What should they be thinking about?
Well, Humboldt offers this really powerful framework for understanding how language, thought, and reality are interconnected. He highlights the role of language, not just as a tool for communication, but as something that shapes how we think, how we experience the world.
So it's about that active role of language in constructing our understanding.
Exactly. And he shows us why we can't separate philosophy of language from empirical linguistics. We need both, that interplay between theory and observation. He critiques those traditional representational theories of language, showing how they fall short. And he emphasizes the dynamic, creative nature of language, how it comes alive in the act of speaking.
So it's a call to pay attention to the nuances, the complexities of language, to see it as this living, evolving thing that shapes our very understanding of ourselves and the world.
Exactly. And as you continue on your own philosophical journeys, think about this. How does Humboldt's idea of a Weltansicht, embedded in each language, how does that challenge those debates about universalism and relativism? And how does his view of communication, as always, involving a degree of non-understanding, how does that impact our understanding of knowledge and truth?
Those are some profound questions to ponder. This deep dive, it's really just a starting point. We encourage you to explore Humboldt's work further, delve into those rich and complex ideas.
Absolutely. His insights are still incredibly relevant today. They offer fresh perspectives on those fundamental questions that continue to fascinate and challenge us as philosophers, as human beings.
So go out there, explore, and let Humboldt's thought provoke and inspire your own philosophical inquiries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep diving deep.